Hey, Leroy, turn it on. Okay, Uncle Shady.
You're listening to BWWR, the Banger Worldwide Radio Network.
The John Lebang Show has been known to make people laugh, sing, think, scream, throw things in rage, and generally lose their minds. Listener discretion is advised.
Scheduled programming to bring you a show on the edge. Broadcasting worldwide and out to the greater universe, you're listening to the John Lebang Show.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the John Lebang Show. And in this edition, we have our good friend Derek Shelmerdine, who I always turn over the host duties, and I'm more like your co-host, Derek, when you're on, because you're so knowledgeable. I just sit back and let you do your thing, and you want to talk about Monterey this month, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be back talking to you, John. Yeah, in Monterey, I mean, it was the 16th to the 18th of June 1967. And it's certainly arguably the most important festival of all of them. It's certainly more significant than Woodstock, partly because of when it was, and partly because of the fact that as we go through talking about the different bands, we'll find people who are now absolute legends. It was Monterey that launched their careers. But I thought it'd be interesting to start with a little bit of sort of contextual background, because it was the height of the Vietnam War, the middle of 67, and also the civil rights situation was still very much to the fore. And I mean, on the 4th of April 67, Martin Luther King made his famous Beyond Vietnam speech, and one of the things he said in that speech was that, more or less quoting, that he was sending young black guys 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they'd not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. And he went on to say that, you know, on the TV screens, you can see young black guys and young white guys killing and dying together for a nation that's been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So, you know, the background to the festival is really important to the kind of music the bands were playing at the time. And just to put it into context again, it's often positioned as the first ever rock festival, but there was actually one called Fantasy Fair and Magic Mountain Festival in San Francisco a week before the Monterey. And you had the Death of Hippie March on the October the 6th, 67. So the whole hippie thing was at its absolute height in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. Then, of course, Woodstock came along in 69. And the 60s really died ideologically with the ill-fated Altamont Festival, when a guy called Meredith Hunter was killed by some Hells Angels. So, you know, the thing about Monterey, it was a happy time. Unlike Woodstock, when it rained all the time, it was sunny. Nobody died. I'm not sure there were too many arrests for anything.
And there were a lot of people there, like 25 to 90,000 people were estimated to be there.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen estimates that across the whole event, 200,000 people attended. That might be a little on the optimistic side, but yeah, it was a very big festival for its time. But it really all started in 1966 with the Monterey Jazz Festival that was on the same at the same venue, the Monterey Fairgrounds. And then you had people like Paul Butterfield and Jefferson Airplane playing there. But what it was, there was a guy called Alan Pariser, and he actually went to the Monterey Jazz Festival with his little mate Ben Shapiro, and they decided, wow, why don't we organize a rock festival? Maybe Judy Garland. Let's do it here. And they thought what they'd do is organize a rock festival at the same venue. Because what they wanted to do, they wanted to legitimize rock in the way that jazz was legitimized. I mean, that was the ninth Monterey Jazz Festival. So what they wanted to do for rock, what it was doing for jazz, and what they wanted to do was have a non-profit 3-day event, and everybody played for free except for a guy called Ravi Shankar, who came to fame with the Beatles. George Harrison, he was an Indian guy who played the sitar, and he apparently was paid $3,000 for the event.
So he was the rock star of the event. Everybody else played for free?
Well, I think what happened was that he got it. He must have been on the earliest ass because his contract was in place before the whole thing really got going, or whether he just insisted on it. But I mean, Chuck Berry was invited, and he turned the opportunity down when he discovered that he wasn't going to get paid for the event.
Right, and the Beach Boys were canceled. Didn't they cancel as well?
They cancelled as well, that's right. I mean, it's interesting. The whole thing was organised over about 6 or 7 weeks. And the first thing Alan Pariser did was contact John Phillips and of the Mamas and the Papas. I mean, he was the brains, if you like, behind the Mamas and the Papas. And the producer of the Mamas and the Papas, Lou Adler. And they pulled together what they called a board of governors. And as well as Phillips and Adler, people like Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, Andrew Oldham, Jim McGuinn, as he was then, the Byrds, he wasn't calling himself Roger yet, Donovan, Smokey Robinson, and Brian Wilson were all on that, and they were the guys that pulled the whole thing together.
And they did that in like 7 weeks too.
Absolutely. When you look at, I mean, we're not talking about all the bands that were there. I've just picked some of the main ones, as it were. So to do that in 2 weeks. What was interesting though, instead of getting paid, because it was non-profit, what they did, I suppose, to entice the bands, is they put them up at really good hotels, which was very rare for rock and roll bands at that time. They also commissioned Pennebaker, the guy that made the Bob Dylan Don't Look Back film, highly rated. And ABC TV decided that they'd have a concert movie for the TV, and they put up $200,000 for Pennebaker to make a movie. But when they saw the rushes, they were less than impressed. They told him he could keep the money, and what he did, he put out a movie at the end of 1968. So it did get to the screens, but it never made ABC TV. It was a little bit too much for the sensibilities of the producers there.
So they just gave up that money.
Well, I think it was a little bit too close to the knuckle. I mean, Hendrix's performance, anybody who's seen a video of it, or was there, of course, I mean, he's cavorting, making love to his guitar, basically. And lots of other things like that, I think, were just a little bit too much for 1967 TV. Because people like the Rolling Stones and the Doors were still being censored on the Ed Sullivan Show around, or a little bit earlier than that, but around the sort of very much in the mid-60s. So it was what went then on TV was very different to what goes now on TV.
I was just going to say that. It's a lot different now. Now you can't keep your clothes on TV.
Absolutely. You look at these reality shows and the language as well, unbelievable. Famously, the Sex Pistols appeared on British TV, said the naughty F word, and 2/3 of their concert was cancelled in the following weeks because they were there promoting their concert. And the host of the show, a guy called Bill Grundy, he was sacked the following day.
Because they said fudge?
Absolutely. the naughty F word. But it's interesting to look at, just before we get into who was there. I mean, some of the big established bands weren't there. I mean, the Beatles had stopped performing by then. They played their last gig in America at Candlestick Park on the 29th of August, 1966. The Stones weren't there because Brian had been involved in a drugs bust, and Mick and Keith had been involved in a second drugs bust, and they just couldn't get a work visa. The Kinks weren't there because they'd been blacklisted in America, essentially by the, very unofficial though, but they effectively been blacklisted by the Musicians Union and the promoters because when they were on tour in mid-65 in America, Ray Davies reputedly punched a union man at a gig, and they took a very dim view of that.
What was the altercation about? Do you know?
I don't know. There are various reasons given. It's one of those things that I've certainly never found a definitive reason. But they missed out on the whole 1960s thing in the States. because they didn't actually get over to tour again until October of '69. And that's quite possibly why Ray Davies's lyrics are very focused, very British-centric, as it were. And as you said before, the Beach Boys, they were due to be there. I mean, Brian Wilson was one of the board of governors, and they were very much scheduled to play. And there's lots of speculation about why they weren't there, because, I mean, they'd had Good Vibrations in late '66, and obviously Pet Sounds. They were a very big band at this time. But what Brian Wilson was doing, he was recording an album called Smile as the follow-up to Pet Sounds. And just a couple of weeks before the Monterey Festival, he actually cancelled the whole project. He was getting a lot of stick from the other Beach Boys because it was very, very experimental. So when he started this process of appearing at Monterey, he'd been working on that. The concert was abandoned a couple of weeks before, and there was no replacement for it. So it might well have been that he was very concerned that all they'd have to play was the old surf hits. The audience that was going might well have been not so interested in that early 1960s stuff. There's no real definitive reason I've ever come across, but certainly you can see why he pulled out of the concert. That was actually, as we'll see later, that was very good news for Otis Redding. Donovan had been bussed as well in a drugs bust by a guy called Sergeant Pilcher, who bussed the Beatles, the Stones, just about everybody. Cream wanted to go, but the manager wanted them to have their own tour, so they missed it.
Wasn't that the show that Mother's Invention they declined to play because Frank Zappa didn't like some San Francisco bands because they were like inferior or something like that?
That's right. I mean, he wasn't keen either because, I mean, he was well established by the time of this particular festival.
I'm not playing with those San Francisco bands. They suck.
Well, he's an interesting guy, Zappa. I've always been quite a big Zappa fan. But it's interesting. I mean, he's got a real doo-wop kind of background, and you can hear it, particularly on his early albums. Absolutely unbelievable. And
didn't Dylan decline because of a motorcycle accident or something at the time?
Yeah, that accident was around this time. I mean, he was out of the picture for about 18 months. He had the accident after the Blonde on Blonde album, and for about 18 months after that, he was out of action. That's another one of these rock and roll mysteries. Even Dylan, in different interviews over the years, has given lots of different accounts of the accident. So there's no real understanding of how serious it was. I mean, it is believed it happened, but it could have been anything from a scratch to a broken something.
Now, why weren't the Doors invited, being that they're a California band?
I don't know why they didn't go, because they were quite big at that. Well, no, they weren't quite big. They were just getting going at that time, and they already had. I mean, Jefferson Airplane there. There's half a dozen what became very mainstream West Coast bands, and the Doors were only just. As all of these bands were, they were only just really getting going in the mid '60s, and the Doors weren't anything like as big as they are now. And that's the whole thing about the '60s. You didn't realize. You didn't realize you're actually living through history. And when Robert Stigwood, the Cream's manager, said, "No, thanks for the invitation, guys, but we'll probably have our own headlining tour in the not too distant future," what he hadn't realized was that Monterey, and arguably Woodstock, people are still talking about them 50 years later.
Don't go anywhere now.
John will be right back right after this.
Yes, he will. Check out the new book from Derek Shelmerdine,
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
It tells the story of rock and roll from its roots right up until the mid-'70s punk.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Not just the music, but also the events that shape the music.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
It includes the backgrounds to recording sessions, singles, album releases, births, and deaths, epic concerts and festivals.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Shelmerdine has made a painstaking effort to document pretty much every event that would prove significant in shaping popular music.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Purchase the book at www.rockandrollunraveled.com. Follow him at Twitter at R&R Unraveled, and look him up on Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
By author Derek Shelmerdine.
Available now.
I think of myself more as a song and dance man, you know.
The only reason that we are still together is that the subtlety of delicate change in the music.
Some of it's old, some of it's new, something borrowed, something brown.
Let's say you have a band that wears makeup, and you've got snakes, and you've got guillotines, and you've got really hard rock, Detroit rock and roll.
I mean, all those groups and people that started off when we were starting off are all still going.
It's funny how many times rock and roll's been dead. Yeah, how many times people have said it's been dead, it just keeps coming back like a bloody phoenix. Rock and roll!
I mean, the Mamas and the Papas were really the first band to get involved, and it was very much John Phillips and Lou Adler who were the guys behind the festival. So they got to close the festival, of course. It's always good when you've got your own particular band that's appearing. Because they started off with hits back in early '66 with California Dreaming, and they had 5 more hits before the festival. So they were one of the few really established bands at the gig. But they're not on. Well, they're not on tour. But interestingly enough, relatives or descendants are on tour in a band called Wilson Phillips. There's Carney and Wendy Wilson, daughters of Brian, and China Phillips, daughter of John Phillips. And they're actually playing. They've only got one gig I can find listed at the moment. That's in California on the 15th of July at Libya Bowl in, I think it's pronounced Ojai. OJAI. That is certainly where it's a good place to be on the 15th of July if you fancy seeing Wilson Phillips on tour. But the gig itself was actually kicked off by a band called The Association. They'd had a hit about a year earlier with Along Comes Mary, and they had a hit just around the time of the festival with Windy. That gave them a number 1, actually. So it's interesting that a lot of bands had their first hit records, and certainly their first number 1s as a result of being on the band. And they're actually on the festival. They're on tour as well, the Association at the moment. You can see them in the USA, Canada, and then back to the USA, 7th of June to the 20th of October. Most of the bands who are playing, which is really interesting, 50 years on, they're still touring, often with some of the original members. You can get detailed information about where the venues are and the prices. Well, not so much the prices, but certainly the tour itself from the website on www.rockandrollunraveled.com.
One of my favorite websites.
Thank you, sir.
Filled with information, Derek. And you do a really great job at all your social media.
It's really interesting delving into stuff. But really now we come to 2 of the most dramatic performances at the festival. I mean, that was The Who and Jimi Hendrix, neither of which were known at all when in America when they arrived at the festival. In fact, the Who had their first hit just in the wake, Happy Jack, just in the wake of the festival, but they were completely unknown. But what's interesting is they both knew of each other in the UK, and they both knew that they each had very, very dramatic stage performances. Jimi Hendrix had already started setting fire to his guitar in the UK, and at this time the Who were still smashing up their entire set of equipment at the end of a gig. So neither of them were keen to follow each other. So
that becomes an expensive tour. You know? How many Fender guitars were burned to death by Jimmy?
Well, most of them, it's only superficial sort of paint damage, fortunately. But the Who's is a bit more significant. The poor old roadies would spend hours afterwards sticking stuff back together, mending speakers, because Townsend had a habit of sticking his guitar through the speaker. But what happened is apparently they tossed a coin, and the Who went on before Hendrix. Usually the argument is about who goes on last. It's interesting, this one was the Who goes on first. But they went on with the Grateful Dead in between them. And they finished up with the guitar and equipment, drum particularly, smashing My Generation. And Roger Daltrey's on tour at the moment. He's in America from the 8th of June to the 18th of August. And he's performing Tommy, which would be well worth catching.
Yeah, there's a lot of good tours this summer, and I'm sure we're going to get to a lot of them here.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting there, if you go to, the Who's website, which is what my link takes it to, and you sort of click on more information about the gigs, what he seems to be doing is instead of taking a particular orchestra on tour, he seems to be performing with a different number of orchestras. So somehow they're getting the local orchestra is getting itself sorted out to back in when the tour rolls into that particular town.
No, that's actually a good idea, because then you don't have to worry about the travel expenses. And most of these orchestras, I mean, they're all professionals, and they know it doesn't take them long to learn music.
Yeah, I mean, they'll just read it. Absolutely superb. And I mean, Hendrix was interesting. He was introduced by Brian Jones. And it's interesting that it was Brian Jones very much, that couldn't get a work visa, but obviously he could get a personal visa, as it were. And he introduced Hendrix. And Paul McCartney and Andrew Oldham, the Stones manager, I mean, they were both very, very keen that Jimi Hendrix appeared at the festival. I mean, they were both on that board of governors. But what's interesting, I mean, Hendrix was completely unknown in America, even though for about 3 years earlier he'd been in the backing band of people like Otis Redding, Sam Cooke, and the Isley Brothers. He'd recorded with the Isley Brothers. But it wasn't until he went over to the UK, Chas Chandler took him over, that he actually found success. And for this concert, he was billed as From London, England, the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
From London, England?
Yeah, so it was as though he was a British band. So
but he's actually from Seattle.
That's right. Yeah, and he'd been very active for a good 3 years before he found success in the UK.
Well, that's interesting. You know, when you talk about Jimi Hendrix, he gets all the credit for the band, but, you know, his drummer, when you're talking about great drummers, Mitch Mitchell was magnificent.
Absolutely. I mean, when you, it's easy to find the famous. He burns his guitar at the festival while he's playing Wild Thing, made famous by the Trogs a year or so earlier, or a little bit earlier. But what's interesting is, obviously, while he's busy setting fire to it, all that's left playing is the drums and the bass guitar, and the sound is just so full. I mean, they were certainly one of the best rhythm sections ever to hit the rock and roll world.
Yeah, and that was a 3-piece band.
Absolutely. It's unbelievable to think about how much noise they could make. Absolutely amazing.
Those days of rock and roll.
Absolutely. But Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees, he was actually at the gig, and he saw Hendrix and thought, this guy's good. So he invited him to join them as the opening act on the Monkees tour that was about to start. I think it was the Monkees' first tour, must have been.
Right. We talked about that a few months back, and the crowd didn't receive him as well as they received the Monkees.
Well, no, I mean, he actually got very bored. The reason he left the tour early was basically because he got a bit fed up of playing his entire set through teenage would be putting the age a little bit high, but 8 to sort of 14-year-old, mostly girls, chanting, "We want the Monkees." So he thought, time to move on. But what was interesting was an Australian journalist lady called Lillian Roxon, and she wrote an article that suggested that the Daughters of the American Revolution had put pressure on the promoters because of Jimi Hendrix's very sexual performance to pull him off the concert. And for years, that's been very much the urban, still is, an urban myth that was why Jimi Hendrix left the gig. But it was actually because of We Want the Monkeys. There's only so many times you can play to that as a background, because he left on friendly terms with the guys.
Yeah, the musics were, just two different genres of rock and roll, and I can't see them mixing very well just in hindsight. So on top of all that, where the fans are going to see the Monkees, it's like, the music probably wasn't appealing to the crowd as much either.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The Beatles would have been better to join up with in that regard if the Beatles were around.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, they'd have been very, very popular. I think the Monkees would have struggled a bit if the Beatles had been on the same bill. Although, they're an interesting band, the Monkees. And in fact, Mike Nesmith and Mickey Dolenz are actually on tour in America and Canada from the 1st to the 25th of June. And if you read what they say about the tour, Mike Nesmith, because he was the first to leave the Monkees, and he was always the one who, because he was a professional musician, unlike the other two, certainly Dolenz, who was a child actor, and Davy Jones was a child actor. Mike Nesmith was very much a songwriter, country artist, and quite popular on the sort of, folk rather than country, I suppose, on the folk circuit. But they're on tour. He's very keen to point out that this isn't a Monkees tour. This is two of the Monkees playing Monkees material. And it's the first time they've ever actually toured as a duo.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And Peter Tork apparently wasn't there because he got a Lead Belly tribute album coming up, and he wants to focus on that. Is the reason I read that he won't be on this tour in June.
You're talking the blues artist Lead Belly?
Yeah.
So he's doing a tribute album for that artist, eh?
Yeah, apparently he's working on it at the moment. It's going to be called Relax Your Mind. I'm not sure if it's actually released yet, but the reports I read were suggesting that he was working on it right now.
Funny story about Lead Belly, just real quick. I had never heard of the artist, and I'm a big fan of the Sanford and Son TV series. Well, Fred Sanford, Red Fox, had brought him up in one of his episodes, so it got me curious. Next thing I know, I was listening to Lead Belly.
Yeah. Well, he was,
and I'm Potbelly.
Absolutely. But he was very influential. It was one of his songs that kick-started British rock and roll. A guy called Lonnie Donegan recorded Rock Island Line, a Lead Belly song. In fact, there was Lead Belly on both sides of the single. And it was that song that's credited with kick-starting skiffle and British rock and roll in the UK. So, the guy is well worth hunting down and listening to. He comes from the sort of folk blues tradition. And he was another one he used to play a lot with Pete Seeger. And, Pete Seeger got blacklisted again this time and earlier in the 60s and the 50s. And Lead Belly was another one that got blacklisted in the sort of McCarthy witch hunts in the sort of late 50s, early 60s. So he's very much part of that whole scene.
Interesting.
But poor old Grateful Dead. The event was filmed, and Grateful Dead refused to have their set filmed, and they were between The Who and Jimi Hendrix. And in an interview, I think it was a Rolling Stone, Phil Lesh says Grateful Dead didn't deliver. And he sort of explained that, well, who's ever going to remember Grateful Dead when they play between The Who and Jimi Hendrix?
No kidding, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. Grateful Dead, they really weren't happy with the gig they did. But they're on tour. They call themselves pretty much Dead and Company now. And it's like a sort of loose ensemble, I think, of various people who've been associated with the Grateful Dead. And you can see them in America, 30th of May through to the 14th of July. But they're another one of these bands who are on the road pretty much all the time. So it's a good idea just to keep, once you've got the address, just keep checking those dates, because I'm pretty sure that the 14th of July will just keep on extending.
They took a little break there after Jerry Garcia passed away, but they were a pretty active band all through the 90s and in the 80s. They didn't, like a lot of bands faded away. The Grateful Dead stuck around.
Absolutely. Yeah, very much. I mean, and they're reckoned to be the most bootlegged band. They actually encourage people to record the concerts. In fact, some of the concerts, they had a little area at the front of the stage for people with their own recorders, and they actively encourage people to record their performances.
Which is interesting that they didn't want their performance recorded at the Monterey Music Festival.
Absolutely. I think, and they also abandoned. They were due to play at Altamont, but decided because the violence was escalating across the day, they pulled out of that particular festival.
Now sit your butt down.
The John LeBang Show will be right back.
And I promise you'll love it. Yes. I'd like to take a quick second here to tell you about our new sponsor, Quality One Painting. For interior and exterior painting needs, call Tom at Quality One, 313-982-2986. Tom will give you free estimates, senior discounts, and I can tell you from meeting the gentleman, he's one of the nicest guys on the face of the planet. So for a quality paint job with a professional attitude, call Tom at Quality One Painting. That's 313-982-2986. 313-982-2986. Quality One Painting.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
If you want to contact the John LeBang Show, feel free to send an email to jlebang@live.com. And if you're on Twitter, look him up at John LeBang. And don't forget to go to his Facebook page at The John LeBang Show. Now here's John.
But one of the bands that really did well out of Monterey was Big Brother and the holding company.
Janis Joplin.
Absolutely. She joined them about a year before. I think she did the first concert around the 10th of June, 1966. But they didn't have any hits. Their first hit, Piece of My Heart, wasn't until the 28th of September, 1968, after the festival. And she left Big Brother about 6 months later, in December 1968. But they did really well. They performed twice. They did an afternoon performance on the Saturday, and people were so impressed with them that they were invited back to do a second appearance. And that first one on the Saturday hadn't been filmed, and it was the second one that was filmed. And it was this festival that really established Janis Joplin's reputation. In fact, Albert Grossman signed the band. He was at the festival and he signed the band, and that's what led to a recording contract at Columbia.
But she left soon after.
That's right. Yeah.
What was the details behind that? Do you know the details behind why she left?
I don't know why she left. I'm not sure. I know that the lead guitarist, whose name escapes me, he left as well, and they formed the Cosmic Blues Band. Maybe she wanted to front the band more.
Sure.
I don't know.
We can chalk it up to musical differences.
That's usually the difference with that.
That's the easy way out of everything. Why'd that happen? Musical differences.
Exactly, and that's really ... and on to something else.
Exactly.
But, absolutely. But they're on tour. Funny enough, Big Brother and the holding company are still touring, and Peter Albin and Dave Getz, who were very early members, I think they were original members, they're still with them. And a lady called Darby Gould is doing the lead vocals now. I mean, she has replaced Grace Slick in the past in Jefferson Starship.
Oh.
So she's well established.
Yeah, she's a veteran.
Yeah, and because Grace Slick retired in the 90s. In fact, there's a wonderful quote from Grace Slick that suggests that all rock and rollers over 50 should retire You can carry on with jazz or country or blues until you're 120. But rock and rollers, they should all retire at 50.
Damn it, I got to retire, man. I got like 6 months left. I better hit it big soon.
Well, there you go, mate.
She says I can go into blues, huh?
Well, that's the thing to do. I mean,
most talk my old blue voice. Blues, jamming the blues.
Exactly, and as you get older, your voice gets deeper, and it just gets it all points down the blues direction. But somebody should tell Mick Jagger, I suppose.
Well, wasn't one of their more recent albums somewhat bluesy?
Oh yeah, their last album.
See, he's following suit, man.
Absolutely. I mean, it was back to the roots. It was all early blues covers. I think it was their first studio album for about 10 years. I can't remember what it was called. Back in Blue or something like that. But it's a really good album. Meanwhile, at the festival, Electric Flag made their debut at the festival. Can you imagine, as a band, the first ever gig you play is at a festival like this? Absolutely incredible.
Oh, yeah. And would they open?
Yeah, that was Mike Bloomfield. He left Paul Butterfield's blues band to form Electric Flag. And they'd actually already got an album out at the back end of 67. It was a movie soundtrack called The Trip. It was a Roger Corman film. And on the film credits, they're billed as the American Music Band because they hadn't actually got the Electric Flag name yet. And in fact, when they were billed for Monterey, they were billed as the Mike Bloomfield thing, which I thought was pretty good. But they took their name from a novelty American flag. Apparently it was on a pole and it flapped in the breeze because it had a little electric fan in its base. I thought that was a great basis for the name of a band.
Yeah, we should do that in the future. Like have a show that we just discuss how names were created for bands, because I think that would be very interesting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so many varied and wonderful names that bands have used over the years. That'd be a great show. I'll have to get that thinking cap on for that one. That'd be a brilliant show.
We'll work on it. We're still on Monterey now. I always divert us. I apologize.
But I mean, Mike Bloomfield, he left the band Electric Flag in mid-68. And interestingly enough, he moved on from Paul Butterfield's blues band, the previous band, after they'd been doing a lot of touring. And he reckoned he was exhausted, and he just effectively walked out of the band. And in mid-68, he was working on an album with Al Cooper called Super Session, and he abandoned that after half the material was recorded, after one side. So if you ever wondered why Steve Stills is on the other side, it's because Mike Bloomfield was meant to be there, but had enough, basically.
Stills from Crosby, Stills and Nash you're talking about.
That's right, yeah. But I mean, interestingly enough, Electric Flag was very much Mike Bloomfield's band, but they are back on the road as well, and you see them in America 15th of May to the 14th of October. And what's great about this is founding members Barry Goldberg and Nick Gravenites, they're still with the band, and Harvey Mandel from Canned Heat, and John Mayall is also playing with the band.
That sounds like a good lineup.
Oh, that will be well worth seeing. I mean, Goldberg and Gravenites, they're veterans of this kind of music. I mean, that really would be great. But Paul Butterfield actually played at the festival as well. Now, they're interesting because they formed around 1963, and they were one of the very first, possibly the first, that was a racially integrated band to have black and white musicians in the early 60s in an American band was very, very rare. And Elvin Bishop was on guitar, and a guy called Jerome Arnold and Sam Lay with the bass and the drums, the rhythm section. They were from Howlin' Wolf's band. So, you can see the pedigree there. Absolutely amazing.
No, it sounds like a great lineup.
And they've done some famous stuff. I mean, they were at that jazz festival in '66, so you can see their credibility was high. But they're the guys that played the Newport Folk Festival in '65 when Dylan did that notorious electric set, and it was essentially Mike Bloomfield's band that was backing Dylan.
Oh, right. That was the one where it got everybody upset because he wasn't playing acoustic, right?
That's right. That's right. But if you'd listened to the music he was doing and had been doing, he'd been playing electric instruments had electric instruments there for quite a while. But there were various reasons suggested why he wasn't popular. One that's often suggested is that they weren't actually booing him because he was playing electric. They were booing him because the mix was so bad they just couldn't hear Dylan's voice.
Yeah, he didn't have a strong, his style of singing isn't power. So if you have any kind of amplification and a real nice set of drums, I could imagine with the PA systems back then, it was probably harder to mix in a vocal of Bob Dylan's stature.
Absolutely. And they wouldn't have been used to mixing, as you say, his voice with electric instruments at that time. So, and I can imagine in open-air festivals, particularly in the mid-'60s, the equipment wouldn't be that sophisticated.
Yeah, when you got good hard rock guitars and you're going, yeah, probably can't hear it too often.
Yeah, I mean, keyboardist Al Cooper there. Well, Al Cooper and Barry Goldberg, and guitarist was Mike Bloomfield, who's arguably certainly one of the earliest blues rock and roll guitar heroes. He died actually in '87 of a drug overdose found in a parked car in a San Franciscan high street. Rather sad.
How many of these guys like to end their lives in a parked car, by the way? Gee whiz.
Stay out of parked cars.
Yeah, it's not funny, but it's just, was he 27 by chance?
No, he was a little bit older than that, but Janis Joplin, Brian Jones, even though he wasn't playing. So there were several of the 27 Club people there. But one of the interesting guys who was there, he played in a couple of bands. It was David Crosby, as Crosby, Stills and Nash. So it's before those three got together. But he was actually with Buffalo Springfield. No, sorry, he was with the Byrds at the time. But he actually stood in for Neil Young in Buffalo Springfield. And it was actually advertised as Buffalo Springfield with David Crosby, which I thought again is an interesting piece of advertising for positioning the show. I mean, they played their last gig in May '68, but there are three of them on tour right now. Steve Stills is actually on a tour with Judy Collins, which would be great fun to watch. That does America and Canada from 7th of May to the 5th of October. And Neil Young's on tour in America, 23rd of June to the 23rd of September. And Richie Furay is touring America 13th of June, well, most of this year now, 13th of June to the 3rd of November. So you can almost see Buffalo Springfield back, but you just have to be at lots of different concerts.
And Neil Young he's another one that just never stops touring. He's always on the road, album or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is he still doing the vegetable oil caravan, where he's using vegetable oil to fuel his caravan?
Oh, I should think so. I mean, that would fit in very much with the way he sees life. Yeah. And he's been writing sort of ecological songs for some little while.
He goes through. I used to see him before the tour. He sent somebody around to all the restaurants. Can we have your used oil?
Exactly.
Smoke them if you got them.
Because the John LeBang Show will be right back
after this. That's guaranteed. Yes. Pane in the Glass, commercial and residential window cleaning for a beautiful sparkling shine that's crystal clear. Call Pane in the Glass Window Cleaning. You can find them on Facebook at Pane in the Glass. You're listening to the John LeBang Show.
Join the radio revolution right here.
It's better than some good Thai stick, man.
Yes, I would like some too.
But David Crosby, I mean, he was in the Byrds, and the Byrds were playing there as well. And I mean, he was actually sacked shortly afterwards. I mean, very shortly afterwards, by Roger McGuinn from the Byrds. I mean, while he was playing the festival with the Byrds, in between songs, he actually spoke out on stage, and he does this. He did this little pitch. How he was suggesting that JFK was killed by multiple shooters, and he disputed the Warren Commission report into JFK's death, because he was really quite outspoken, which probably went a long way to Roger McGuinn thinking, whoa, it's time David moved on, I think.
Yeah, he was one of those conspiracy theorists?
Absolutely. Yeah, very much so. Again, you can find that on the internet, the bit where he's speaking out about his views on the JFK assassination. But at the beginning of January, the Notorious Byrd Brothers album was released, and David Crosby's still on that. But that's the one with the cover that has, it's a Stables, I think, and you've got three of the band with their heads out the window, and David Crosby doesn't appear on the sleeve. The fourth window, there's a horse's head sticking out of the window. So
they pulled a McCartney in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's another one of those. The sort of jury's out as to whether it was a deliberate pop at Crosby, but I think it probably was. But again, he's on tour at the moment, David Crosby. I mean, he's all over the place. You can see him in America, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, and Italy. He's not coming to the UK yet, but those dates might be added. That's 19th of May through to the 13th of September. And Roger McGuinn, the only guy that was in the original lineup of the Byrds and was the only member to go right through the whole history of the Byrds to their final gig. He's touring America he's got 2 gigs. It's not a tour, but he's got 2 gigs listed on the 30th of June and the 16th of March next year. So whether he's got some, well, I would guess that he will add some dates between those two he's got listed there. And Chris Hillman, of course, who was a major part of the early Byrds. He's touring America 19th of April to the 22nd of September.
Lot going on.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, if you could pick one of these tours to go see, which one would you go see?
Ooh, wow. I think the Electric Flag is one of the ones I would want to try and catch, because I mean, seeing Barry Goldberg, Nick Gravenites with Harvey Mandel, I mean, that would be a really, really good gig.
Yeah, you've got me thinking about Roger Daltrey. I think if he comes through Detroit, I think I'm going to go see that show.
Yeah, I mean, to see Tommy again now, particularly with a full orchestra, I mean, that would be brilliant.
I was going to say, I was really too young to enjoy the Who during their prime. So, and my only real live experience I had with the Who in general was a video they put out. It was like MTV back in the 80s, where it was live in Toronto. And that's what actually broke me into liking the Who. It took me middle of 1980s to figure out who the Who were. I would like to actually have the full live experience.
Oh, that would be great, because he's such an integral part of that. Being the voice of Tommy. I mean, that would be a brilliant gig to go to. Yeah, now, he does a lot of stuff as well.
Is there a reason they don't tour as a band anymore? I know they don't. They'd have to bring in a different drummer, but in general, do they not get along?
Well, yeah. I mean, they famously have never really been bosom buddies, but there's only the two of them left now. They do tour separately, and they do tour together still. Because they will make a lot of money, because when he goes out with Townsend, of course, they'll go out as the Who, because Townsend toured Quadrophenia recently. I think it was last year. So there's lots of good opportunities to catch them,
and there's good opportunities to catch you. I guess you got a book signing coming up, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's in Leeds, in the north of England. I know the show is syndicated across the UK, America, and Australia. So for people listening in the northeast of England, I'll be doing a book signing in Leeds on the second Saturday of the month.
Of the month of June.
I started doing that. It's the 9th of June. He says, quickly looking at his calendar.
I hit you up. I knew you weren't ready for it. That's all.
That's perfect. No, what's happened is I've done a couple of them there now, and it's actually a record fair and book fair. So it's predominantly a record fair. So I take a few singles and albums as well, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it's just a great day. There's some fabulous dealers there with some really good albums and stuff, and I get to talk to so many good people. People come up and we start chatting about rock and roll and music business in general, and it's just so much fun. I really enjoy it.
And what kind of records will you be bringing with you?
Well, what it is, it's mostly it's all from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a little bit of 80s, but I got 45s there and albums. So there's a lot of be a lot of Beatles stuff. Bob Dylan. I'm taking a lot of Bob Dylan for the first time this time because I've got quite a few good condition Dylan albums I want to take with me. And
so you're not only are you an author and a rock and roll historian, you are a collector of this music.
That's right. Yeah, and a dealer in that sense, because I used to do a lot of record fairs before while I was working on the book, and then I hadn't done any for a couple of 3 years because I've been traveling around a lot. But now I'm getting back into doing regular record fairs because they're great places to do a book signing, because pretty much everybody who comes in is interested in, by definition, interested in music. And if you're interested in the music, modern day music, or the 80s or the 90s, it's all got its roots in the 50s and 60s, and that's all got its roots in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So, looking at the roots of everything all the time tells you more and more about the music that you like, whatever that music is, really.
Is there a album of yours that's a cold dead hand album, one you'll never get rid of, not even out of your cold dead hand?
No, I've got a few like that. It's stuff I bought at the time, like Jimi Hendrix's first album, the Pink Floyd's first album, Stone's first album, Frank Zappa, one or two of his. Oh, Junior Walker and the All Stars as well. I bought the Roadrunner album because I really like that era of Motown, particularly Junior Walker.
You know why I had this line of questioning? Because I'm trying to set up next month because we're going to talk about our top 100 albums or something close to that, aren't we?
Absolutely. Oh, there'll be a few of them in there. It's interesting to see that it wasn't Sgt. Pepper that topped that list as well.
The one I sent you, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it was number 4, I think, offhand. So it was certainly there, but it's a really good list. That particular compiler, it's got some really good classic albums in there.
Yeah, I think because of my age group, I would have swapped a couple of things out for other records. I was really wondering why some of the later ones, they didn't include Whitesnake's Slide It In album, because I thought, for the 80s, that was an outstanding record. And, David Coverdale's one of the best singers of all time, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely.
And he's kind of overlooked because, he did the Whitesnake thing. But before that, he was in Deep Purple.
That's right, yeah.
When Glenn Hughes was in the band.
Yeah. I've always been interested in where people came from in a lineup, where they went to, because that's how you get into different bands as well.
Exactly. I just segued again for you. I knew you would bring up your book right there when I did that.
Right.
Speaking of your book, did I cut us off on anything before we get to your social media and stuff?
No. Yeah. Well, I'm very active on Twitter and Facebook. Twitter's at RNR Unraveled, and Facebook's at Rock and Roll Unraveled. And what I look to try and do is most days post something that happened on this particular day. But what I'm looking to do is build more and more background stuff around the book. So it's all factual stuff. And a lot of it is interesting gigs that have gone on. If I come across a poster that shows a bunch of people, sometimes in combinations that you weren't really expecting, I like to post stuff like that. So it's just great fun because often people then respond. I had Paul Jones respond to me on Facebook once. I'd written this thing about the very early Rolling Stones, how they came together, and we're talking about. I'd done this thing that included Thunder Odin, a band that Paul Jones. It was actually Paul Jones's band, and he Facebooked me, if that's the right term, to say that he'd invited Brian Jones to join the band, but Brian declined. But they did play together sometimes, and they recorded a tape, and they gave it to Alexis Corner to try and get him interested in them. So it's amazing the responses you sometimes get in Twitter and Facebook.
I mean, when you were a kid and growing up, did you ever think you this is where you would end up and the cool stuff that you would come across at this point?
In the sense of I've always been interested in music ever since I can remember. And I sort of grew up in the 50s and 60s, so that was great. So there was something new happening all of the time. I've always been interested in, most of the British stuff in certainly the 50s and early 60s were covers of American R&B, American blues. So I was always interested in trying to listen to the original versions of stuff, which was very difficult then because the radio in the UK played very little music. And
yeah, you had to listen to the offshore station to get anything good.
Exactly. I mean, pirate radio arrived in the early 60s, and that was when pop music became, available most of the day. And it was great stuff. And that was when you started to hear a lot of the more obscure stuff. That was great. Awesome.
Derek, when's your book signing one more time?
It's in Leeds on the 9th of June. And that's a Saturday.
So I expect everybody listening in on all our great affiliates in the United Kingdom to go see our buddy Derek Shelmerdine. That's an order from the John Lebang Show. Got to do something to support it's people that support us.
That will be great. And when people come along and they mention they heard it on the show, that'll be absolutely dynamite.
Anyways, Derek, I really appreciate you coming out this month and joining us and pretty much hosting the show. I'm like your co-host for this hour, and I'm happy to be.
Oh, it's just so much fun chatting about these various bands. And I mean, one of the things we were just talking about, how you get one guy's in this band, then that band. Funnily enough, there's a guy called Skip Spence who was in 3 of the most influential West Coast bands at the time. I just about to mention that Jefferson Airplane were at the festival. And I mean, they played all the festivals. They were at Magic Mountain, Monterey, Woodstock, and Altamont. I mean, they really were a major band at the time. And they had a first hit single with Somebody to Love around the time of the festival. It was interesting that in 1969, 2 of them, Jack Cassidy, the bass player, and Joe McCauken, the guitarist, they split off and formed Hot Tuna. And Jefferson Airplane themselves didn't split up till 72. So those 2 bands are running in parallel for 2 or 3 years, which is good stuff. And then they got back together, well, minus Kaukonen and Cassidy, because they decided they'd rather stay with Hot Tuna. But the others got back together as Jefferson Starship in the spring of 1974. And in fact, both of those bands are on tour now. Jefferson Starship, both tour in America. Starship, you can see, 2nd of March to the 29th of July. And Hot Tuna, 24th of March to the 1st of December.
Well, Derek, we're up against the time. We're going to have to get out of here. I appreciate you coming on and being the host this hour. And we'll talk to you next month.
Oh, my pleasure, John. I've really enjoyed talking to you. All the very best.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff. Tune in again next week. Same time, same space, same station.
Resistance is futile.